Today we're going to be practicing our SQL skills with the HackerRank website. SQL stands for Structured Query Language, and it's used for getting data out of a database. When you first go to the HackerRank.com website, HackerRank.com, you'll notice that it has a section for candidates. The rest of it is for companies, because companies use this for hiring people. We're just going to use the candidate section. So first you'll want to create an account or log in, and it's totally free, so don't worry about that. Okay, I'm logged in, and you can see I have a list of topics I can practice. Today we're just going to be doing SQL, but if you're interested in other programming technologies, you can practice those here as well. Once I click on SQL, I have a list of challenges. The first ones on the list just say easy. If I scroll down, eventually I'll get to medium and hard challenges as well. So we'll just start with the top one. When it opens up, you'll see on the left side the question I'm supposed to solve, and on the right side where I type my answer. And this is not just a normal text field where I can type an answer. It actually is connected to a real database engine. So I can actually execute the code and see what results I get so that I can verify if my result is correct, and I can debug if my result is wrong to figure out what I'm doing wrong. The first thing you're going to want to do when you open up a new challenge is on the top right corner, pick which database engine you want to use. It does matter which one you pick because the syntax is slightly different. The SQL language is fairly standardized, but there are slight differences between them. So if you're familiar with a specific syntax and you pick the wrong engine, the commands you're used to using are not going to work. Now, if you've never used SQL before, you probably don't know which one is the best to pick. In general, I would say avoid DB2 because that one's not very popular. Any of the other three you'll be fine with. And my personal favorite one is actually called Postgres, and it's not on this list. So you can practice in here with that, but if you downloaded Postgres and practiced with it on your own, you could do that as well. But if you're just learning as a student and you're hoping to get a job, rather than picking what's your favorite, which one's the funnest, it's probably best to think about the job opportunities. So the way you would do that is in a separate browser tab, I'm going to pull up Indeed.com. And you'll notice I can search for a specific technology to see what jobs are available. So if I pick DB2, you'll see there's 4,000 jobs. So it's not that it's not used at all, but that's not a very high number because that's searching the entire United States. If I put in MySQL, I have 17,000 jobs. So it's about 4 times as many jobs. So I guess that could mean you have a 4 times higher chance of getting hired, but you might also have more competition. So there's not necessarily any guarantee because maybe there's more programmers that also know MySQL. SQL Server, which is Microsoft's, it's more popular than MySQL. It has 30,000 jobs. And Oracle is even higher than that. It's at 65,000 almost. And the one I prefer, which is Postgres, is about as popular as MySQL. So it has 10,000, actually a little bit less than MySQL. The reason I prefer Postgres, both Postgres and MySQL are free, so that's very useful if you're doing a personal project. SQL Server has a free version, but it's limited. So if you're doing a startup company, it would work great for a year or so. And then once you start making money, you would need to use the more advanced features and you'd have to start paying. Whereas Postgres and MySQL are free forever. I honestly don't know as much about Oracle, so I don't know if it has free options. But the crazy thing to me with Postgres is I actually think it's more powerful and better than SQL Server in most ways. There are a few downsides to it compared to SQL Server, but in general, I like it better even though it's free. So in my case, I'm going to pick Microsoft SQL Server because that's what I'm most familiar with. And the reason I'm most familiar with it is because I'm a full stack programmer. And so I do websites, mobile apps, and backend code. And I typically stick to the Microsoft stack for the entire stack. So for the front end, I'll use TypeScript instead of JavaScript because that's Microsoft's version of JavaScript, which I think is actually a little bit better than the traditional JavaScript. And then for the backend, I'll use C#, which is Microsoft's version of C++. So because I'm sticking with only Microsoft technologies for the entire application, it just has a little bit better integration. So that's why I've chosen not to use Oracle. Most companies I've worked for, because they use Microsoft across the entire stack. One other thing you might want to consider, so maybe you're wondering, should I learn databases or should I learn web app development or mobile app? So programming is similar no matter which technology you're using. The SQL syntax is very different than the C++ syntax because one's for databases and one's for just normal applications. But the way you learn to think logically about how to solve a problem, that programmer mindset, it's going to be similar. And once you've learned one technology, it's not too hard to learn another technology. However, something to think about is if you're first starting out, you kind of want the lowest barrier to entry, meaning that you don't want to pick something too complicated where you have to learn too many technologies. For example, a full stack developer has to know front end and back end because they're doing both parts of a website. And back end also includes databases. So every programmer that does back end or full stack also has to know SQL. But there are jobs that are only SQL. So if you start with just SQL, you could get your first job, and then afterwards you could learn back end technologies and get a job that uses both, and then you can learn front end and get a job that uses all three or full stack. So that's just an option if you don't want to bite off more than you can chew. Because if you're going to choose to just start with back end, you're still going to have to learn SQL anyways. So in order to help you think about this a little bit more, I'm going to pull up a job salary guide. So this is from a recruiting company called Robert Half. So they work with a whole bunch of different companies and they try to find jobs for people. And because of that, they have a good idea of how much people get paid in each job. And so if I scroll down, so you can download this, it's just a PDF document from their website. And this is actually from the year 2021. So it's a year old. But if I scroll down, okay, here it lists job titles. So you've got software developer, which is someone that makes applications. And the 25th percentile is going to be either someone that's a beginner or someone that just happens to work for a company that underpays their programmers. And it's saying that the national average in the US is 97,000. So the 95th percentile would be someone that's really an expert in that field. So maybe they have a lot of years of experience, or maybe they just happen to be working for a company that just pays really, really well. And that's saying it could be up to 165,000. So that's kind of your range. So, and there's very similar job titles. So software engineer, software developer, there's honestly not really a difference between the two, but people just like different terms. And that's why their salaries are fairly similar. But there are jobs that are very different. So software developer or engineer is generic. They could be doing websites, they could be doing backend apps, they could be doing mobile apps. It's not specialized. Usually the more specialized you are, the more you get paid. So mobile apps, they don't have to do websites and they don't have to do, backend or database code necessarily, but because they're specialized in one thing, they actually get paid a little bit higher. So the reason I bring this up, we're actually talking about databases today. And I mentioned that if you're going to be a full stack programmer, you still have to learn SQL, but you could get your first internship job with SQL only without having to learn the entire full stack of, a back-end language like C# and a front-end language like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So for a database, someone that just only knows SQL, maybe that would be like a reporting analyst or a report writer. They do have a slightly lower pay scale than what the software developer showed, but it's still fairly close. So that might be a good starting point if you just learn SQL. And then you could, if you decide you want to learn other types of programming languages, you can move on from there. So I think it's best to start with a goal in mind before you start studying, because your path is going to be better. You're not going to waste your time studying things that don't necessarily help you. Okay, back to SQL. So a database is essentially just storing a whole bunch of information. And in this case, the example it's giving me, first let me change to Microsoft SQL Server before I forget. The example data it's giving me is a table called city, and it has fields. Another name for that is columns. And each column is like a variable, so it has a data type. So a city has an ID, and an ID is a unique identifier that is easier for the computer to think about a concept or a record. So an example for that in the US would be a social security number. Every person has a social security number, and that's the way that they're uniquely identified. And every database in the world, when it adds your name to the system, it's going to tie it to either something unique like social security number or like email address or like phone number, because there might be another person with your same exact name and it needs to be able to distinguish between you. So an ID field is like a unique identifier. And so it's a number because part of what makes names difficult or ambiguous, non-unique, is the fact that they're letters. And also letters are harder for a computer to process than numbers because computers are calculators behind the scenes. So they process numbers faster than letters. So anyways, an ID, because it's a number, generally just automatically increments. So the very first record you create, so in this case, city, if the first city I create is Los Angeles, it's going to be ID 1. If the second city I create is Las Vegas, it's going to be ID number 2. And then country code it says so varchar, that stands for variable length character. A character is one key on your keyboard. So like the letter A or the letter B. By variable length, it means where it has in parentheses the 3 or the 17, that's the maximum length it could be. So the city, I don't know how long Las Vegas is. Let's count it out. Okay, Las Vegas is 9 characters long, so that fits within the 17, so that's totally safe. It doesn't have to use the entire 17, that's because it's variable length. But if I tried to put in a super long city name, like, I don't know, maybe Rio de Janeiro or something, if it's longer than 17, it will truncate or cut off the end. And so country code is 3, so that could be something like USA. I'm not honestly sure what district would mean. And that's something every company is going to have their own database, and they're going to define the columns whichever way they want based on how their business runs. So sometimes there are going to be columns that you don't know instinctively what they mean, and you're going to have to ask a coworker, and it's just kind of tribal knowledge that gets passed down through generations of working at the company. So I'm not sure what district means, but hopefully the instructions will tell me if I need it and what to use it for. So obviously population is just going to be the number of how many people live in that city. I'll just do a statement to query the data, and we'll see what it looks like. Okay, I'll explain what the select star from city means in a minute, but let me just show you the output first. So I mentioned that the ID is a number. So number 6 is the first number in here. Name is a variable length character of max length 17. So Rotterdam is the first city, which has ID 6. And this entire record or row is like one entry in that table. And it's completely separate from the second entry or the second record in the table. So a table has rows and it has columns. A row is a grouping of columns that are all related to each other. So this Rotterdam is related to Holland because it's inside of Holland, whereas Scottsdale is related to Arizona. So each record is separate, and the columns are like attributes of the city that you're wanting to store or analyze. So let's get back to the actual SQL query. There are multiple types of commands in SQL. Select means that I want to read the data. Update says I want to modify the data, and that's modifying existing data. Insert says I want to add a new row to the data, and delete says I want to remove a row from the data. Insert and delete are manipulating an entire row at a time. Update could modify just one column, but it still is going to be specific to one row. And you can also do multiple rows at the same time, but you don't have to modify the entire record if you wanted. You could just modify one column in that row. But for now, we won't talk about update, insert, or delete. That's for another day. Select means I want to read data out of a table. And I like to format like this. The asterisk means the columns that I'm wanting to read. And asterisk just means every column. So it would be identical to me typing out each column one at a time. And so the reason I like to format it this way is I think it's a little bit more readable to have the command as the first row, the table as the third row, and then in between them to have a list of columns with a tab. And when you're only doing a very simple query, it probably doesn't matter. But once you get into more complex queries, having your code formatted in a readable way is important. So let me just run this a second time so that we can see that I still get the same type of data, the 6 Rotterdam. So if I hit run, okay, so here I got an error. So it says runtime error, your output, it says invalid column name county code. So I actually have a misspelling here. It's country code. So anytime you run an SQL statement or any programming code, you want to read the error messages carefully to understand what you did wrong. So let me run that again. Okay, it's back to what I had before, 6 Rotterdam. So you can see that the asterisk returns every column, and here I've written them all out, so it's the same thing. So if I were to take population off, right now I have 593321. If I remove population when I run it, that number should be missing in the results. And here you can see it's missing. An important thing to note is select is not modifying the data. The data is still the same in the database and in that table. It's just modifying how I view the data. So even though I removed population from my query, it's not deleting that data out of the database. It's just not showing it on the screen. Okay, and the from command, that just says which table I want to get the data out of. And so here I've called it the name city, which is from their example. That's what the table is called. So now let's read their instructions. They say they want me to query all columns. So I have written out all columns. And although I could have used the asterisk here, it's considered bad practice to use the asterisk. So when you're just testing your code, it's fine to use the asterisk as a way of being lazy. But when you're ready to put your code into production, you really should list out the specific column names. And one reason is for readability, because if more columns are added or removed in the future, then this makes it obvious which columns you actually needed. In some cases, you may not actually need every column. But the more important thing is there's a huge performance difference. If you choose to only return the actual columns you need instead of all of them, it's significantly faster. And I'll explain the reasons why later. But as a standard good practice, just always put your full column list, or always specify the individual columns that you need. Don't use the asterisk unless you're just doing a quick test code and you're trying to be lazy. Okay, next it says that I want all columns from the city table and I want the populations to be larger than 100,000. So if I rerun this with the population so we can see the numbers, you can see that Rotterdam has a population of 593,000. So that is larger than 100,000. So I do want to keep that row in the final output, but it doesn't want me to display any small cities. So Boulder, Colorado only has 90,000. So that should be excluded. And again, I'm not deleting it from the table. I'm just not showing it on the screen. So pretend that you're making a report. Maybe the CEO of the company wants a report saying information about their customers or what cities they live in. They might give you this kind of criteria, tell me only big cities, not small cities. So the command to filter a result in a SQL query is called where. And to filter, you list the column that you want to run a condition on, and then you use a mathematical symbol. So in this case, I'm going to do the greater than sign to say population's larger than, and then I can just copy and paste this number or retype it. And so essentially this is saying, read these columns from the city table and filter based on population being larger than 100,000. So Boulder, Colorado should be removed from the result, but Rotterdam should stay included. So let me run it. Okay, it says I still have the wrong answer, but Boulder, Colorado was missing. So let's look at the expected output to see what I did wrong. In my case, I have 6 rows. In their case, they only have 5 rows. So I'm including one extra row that I'm not supposed to. And then also, okay, at first I thought maybe it was sorted wrong because I noticed that Scottsdale was number 2 on the list, and here it's number 1 on the list. But everything else is in order, so it looks like the only extra one I have is just Rotterdam. So I should reread my instructions to see what I missed. And this is one very important thing about making reports in a company is you need to have really good attention to detail to understand what requirements the business is asking you for before you make the report, because the business is not going to know the correct answer. They're asking you to tell them the answer. But if you misunderstand their requirements, you could give them the completely wrong answer and they might not necessarily know, but they could make the wrong decision based on that. So you want to make sure your logic is correct and that it matches the requirements they gave you. So I didn't finish reading the question. That was my mistake. It says the country code needs to be USA because it says all American cities. So I included Holland. So to include a second condition, I'm going to use the AND command, and then I'll list my second condition. So country code equals, and then I use single quotes. Anytime you're using text, you need to put it in single quotes so that it knows where the text starts and ends. And that's called a string, like a string of characters, if it's text. So I'm going to say USA. So the equal sign is just doing the mathematical comparison of when it's filtering these rows, it's checking if the country code matches the value USA. And in most programming languages, letters are case sensitive. So there's a difference between a lowercase USA and an uppercase USA, or even a capital U, lowercase s, and capital A. Now that's true of most languages, but SQL in particular, at least Microsoft SQL Server, by default is case insensitive, meaning the case does not matter. So it should be the same whether I do it uppercase or lowercase. Now that's the default. It's possible that the database administrator changed that default. So you should double check, but in general, you can plan to not worry about if the case is correct or not. So let me run my code, and it says I'm correct. So that's great. One tip you may want to consider anytime you're doing a string comparison, depending on your database, if you have a lot of dirty or bad data in your system, if you don't have a database administrator that's checking to make sure the data is like verifying if the data is accurate, then you could have mistakes you want to watch out for, in particular with strings. So as an example, let's think of a different country code, like maybe Canada. I'm assuming that would be just CA. Well, the country code says varchar 3, meaning I can have a maximum of 3 characters. Well, I mentioned that the case insensitivity, where CA uppercase and CA lowercase are the same. However, spaces sometimes matter depending on the database engine you're using. So the CA with a space would be considered different than CA without a space. So that's something when you first start working with a new database, you should just double check if that situation happens. Maybe just pick a few random text columns and check if they have spaces at the end, or write an example query and see if spaces are ignored or not. But in case they're not ignored for your particular database, you may want to run a trim command on that column, and trim just removes any extra spaces. So in that case, if country code was CA with a space, trimming it converts it to just CA. So when it does the comparison, it will match. And I wouldn't just automatically throw a trim on every column because it will slow down the processing. I would only do that if I'm getting results that I don't expect, and test that to see if it fixes the result. But just something to keep in mind. So it looks like this particular test is completed. It says congratulations. Okay, it says I earned 10 points. And I don't exactly know what I can do with these points. But I think eventually I get a certificate I can put on my resume if I want it. And I think maybe there's like some paid tests or something, but you can use points to unlock the tests or something. So let's just move on to the next challenge. Okay, this looks almost identical. The city column is identical to the last one. And it says, in this case, only the name field rather than all fields. And it wants me to use a population of 120,000 instead of 100,000. Otherwise, it looks the same. It's still wanting only USA or American city. So I wish I had kept the old code in my clipboard so I could paste it and just modify it slightly, but I can retype it, that's fine. Okay, this is almost identical to the last one. I already showed in the previous example how I could modify which columns are being displayed. So that's really the only change I made here. And then I changed this from 100,000 to 120,000. And one thing to note, I chose to use the casing on these words that is most readable. So country and code are two different words, but usually columns do not have spaces in them because variable names in programming languages normally do not like spaces. So in order to make it readable when there's no space, I choose to use an uppercase when I start the word code. However, in the screenshot on the left, you notice I can't select the text because it's an image, but so it's more like a screenshot, but they chose to uppercase everything. So similarly, like I mentioned before with case insensitivity, it's not only true of just strings, it's also true of variable names. So, and that's not true of every language. In some languages, if you change the casing of a variable, it becomes a different variable. But in this case, it doesn't matter if I lowercase or uppercase code inside of country code, it still is the same column. So you do want to write your code as readable as possible. And I always use uppercases when I'm doing keywords that are part of the language itself. So name, city, population, and country code are not part of the language. Those are parts of the database that I've defined, tables and columns. And then these values, 120,000 in USA, those are parameters that I'm filtering with. And so those are also not part of the database language itself. But and, where, from, and select are part of the database language. So I choose to uppercase them just to make it more obvious and readable. And it's also nice that this editor color codes them in purple. and the parameters it color codes, the red for text and green for numbers. Every editor is going to be different in how it color codes. So let's run the code, make sure I coded it correctly, and then move on to the next one. Looks good. Submit. I earned 10 points. Next challenge. Okay, this one says all columns again for every row in the city table, same table. And it looks like I have no criteria. So I probably should start skipping ahead to more advanced queries because I've basically done the same thing 3 times in a row. But the only difference here is I'm just not going to do a where clause because I'm not doing any filter at all. So it's not just USA this time, it's every country. And it's not only large population cities, it's any population. And out of laziness, I'm going to use the asterisk because I want all columns and I just don't want to retype them all. But as I said earlier, in production, I would specify the individual columns actually. So I'll run my code. Looks like I got it right. I'll submit it. I think the reason the submit and run are separate is I think the run only executes one test, and I think the submit executes multiple tests. Okay, looks like I got it right. Next challenge. Okay, this one's very similar to before. I'm not going to go into much depth on explaining it. Okay, same as before, the only difference is the where clause criteria is slightly different. In this case, I'm looking for a specific ID. Now, something to note of here, I chose to put the 1661 in quotes, which means that this is actually a string or text, but the ID is a number. When you use the equal sign for comparison, as well as any other type of math operation like a plus sign or a greater than sign, the math operation only works if both sides are the same type of data. So what it will do is it will automatically convert from one type of data to another if it needs to. So in order to compare a string of characters to a number, it will either need to convert the string of numbers, or the string of characters to a number, or it'll need to convert the number to a string. And the reason this matters is the number 1661, to us, this looks like a number, but because I put it in quote, to the computer, it's thinking of these as letters. Because numbers only have meaning in math. They don't, outside of math, numbers and letters don't have a difference in meaning. And let me explain that a little bit better. I'm going to open up a Google tab and search for something called an ASCII table. Okay, this is an ASCII table, and this is one possible way that the computer represents characters. And so if I look for the letter A as an uppercase, unfortunately I can't highlight it, but if you look at my mouse, because it's an image, I can't highlight it. If you look at my mouse, the letter A corresponds to the decimal number 65. And you can ignore HX stands for hexadecimal, OCT stands for, I don't know how to pronounce it, octal. So we count in tens. So DEC for decimal stands for 10, I think in Latin. Hex stands for 16 and oct stands for 8. So think about like a hexagon or octagon. So hexadecimal and octal are different ways the computer can count. Decimal is how, as humans, we prefer to count. So just ignore the hexadecimal and octal. But the letter A is 65, but that's an uppercase A. The lowercase a is a 97. And then the actual number 0, when it's a number, it's obviously 0. But when it's considered a letter, the letter uses the number 48. So that's probably a little bit weird to think about. But the number 0, when you convert it to a letter, it's actually the number 48. Because the number 0 stands for null, which is like the absence of a letter. And so ASCII can also do characters that you can't visibly see. Like for example, the enter key, I believe that's 13. So right here, the number 13 is CR, which stands for carriage return or enter key. So if we go back to the database query, I chose to put this in a string. So as I mentioned, it's going to have to convert this automatically to a number or to an integer. Or convert the ID from a number to text. It should still work, but that was laziness on my part, or maybe bad practice on my part to put it in quotes, because when it has to convert between data type, it actually can slow down the query. But the nice thing is it was able to do it for me automatically. Now, if I wanted to, I could convert it myself. So int stands for integer, and that's just a number that can't have a decimal, because decimals are harder for the computer to process. And so if you want to use decimal, you use a different data type for that. The computer tries to be as efficient as possible. So if you know that you're never going to have a decimal, you specify your variable in a regular programming language or your column in a database language, you specify as an integer so that it can avoid doing the extra processing required for decimal. So the cast command allows you to convert between data types. So if I run this again, I'll still get the same result. But internally, it was already doing this cast for me. And so even if I explicitly tell it to cast, it's still slower, just like the automatic cast. So ideally, when I do a comparison, I should make both data types the same. I should type it as a number rather than as text. And I do that just by removing the quotes. So then when I run, it'll still give me the same results, but it will be slightly faster. And sometimes speed doesn't matter. Computers are very fast. You know, the difference between 1 second and 2 seconds is not very much to a human, but it's a lot to a computer. In fact, computers a lot of time might even be like 1,000th of a second, which is called a millisecond. And so when you think about a database is handling maybe a website like Amazon, they maybe have millions of people all ordering things at the same time. So every millisecond counts, because if you optimize your code, the website and database can handle more users at the same time. However, programmers are also expensive. We looked at salary guides earlier and saw that the average programmer makes about 100,000 or more a year in the USA. So, you know, if you can do a very simple fix to make your code faster, you should definitely do it. But if it's going to take you a month of extra work to optimize for a faster code, it may not necessarily be worth it. You would want to, you know, analyze the value that it brings to the business. You know, how much money is it going to save them, as opposed to how much money they're paying you in salary. Because, you know, computers are not too expensive. If it's going to take you a month to optimize the code, it might be cheaper to just buy a faster server. So just some thoughts. So if you choose to do optimization when they're not actually necessary, then that's called premature optimization. But in general, the more you practice with writing good code, you'll tend to just write it in an optimal way the first time without actually having to spend a lot of time analyzing it or thinking critically about it. It should just come natural with practice. So at least when you're learning, you want to just use best practices from the beginning so you don't learn bad practices. So I'm going to submit my code and move on to the next one. Okay, this is almost the same as before. It just wants me to use Japan for the country code. It says all attributes. So I'm not going to explain the query. It should be pretty obvious. And I'm surprised it's not working. Oh, I don't know what happened, but somehow on the top right corner, it got changed to DB2. And I mentioned this earlier, every SQL language has a slightly different syntax. I've never used DB2 before, so I don't know exactly what's wrong here. I'd have to kind of read the error code and analyze it. But if I switch it back to SQL Server, and it's going to make me retype it, it should work this time, I think. Perfect. Submit. Next challenge. Now, you may want to... I feel like this gave me the exact same challenge I just barely did. Oh, no. Instead of all attributes, it wants just the names. So you may want to pause before I start typing and think in your head of how you would code it, because you're going to learn more from figuring it out yourself than you are from just copying my answer or reading my answer. But we haven't learned any new concepts here, so I'm not going to explain the code. I'm just move on to the next test. Next challenge. Okay, good. We're finally getting to a new type of table. So it says query a list of city and state from the station table, and here's the table. So since it doesn't actually need the latitude or longitude yet, I don't really need to worry about that, and but just the city and state columns. And it doesn't have any criteria it's asking me for either. Okay, next challenge says query a list of city names from station for cities that have an even ID number. Print the results in any order, but exclude duplicates from the answer. Okay, we are getting into slightly more advanced SQL here. So whenever you're writing a query and you're not exactly sure how to solve it, then you want to just break it down into smaller pieces one at a time. So for example, it's asking me for an even ID number. So like even versus odd. So even would be 0, 2, 4, 6. And then the results can be sorted in any order, but then the duplicates need to be excluded. So I'm not going to worry about any of this yet. I'm just going to worry about the first piece, which says query a list of city names from station. So select city from station. That part you should already be familiar with. We've done it lots of times before. And the reason I'm just doing one piece at a time is because as a question gets too long, it can feel overwhelming. And so don't get scared. Just break it down into small pieces and do one piece at a time. So next it says it wants me to filter for just ones that have an even ID number. So if I'm filtering, I know I want to use the where command, and I know I'm using the ID column. The only question is, how do I determine if it's even or odd? Okay, so you may not be familiar with the mathematical way of how to determine if a number is even or odd, but there is a concept called a modulus, and the other word for that is remainder. So when you divide something, it has a remainder if it doesn't evenly divide. So if I divide something by 2, so use the / to do division. If I divide the number 4 by 2, it's going to equal 2. But if I divide the number 5 by 2, it's going to equal 2.5. So the remainder is this 0.5. And the other way to write this remainder would be the number 1, because it's kind of saying 5 minus 1 divided by 2 equals 2, meaning that if you subtract 1 from it, it now divides evenly. There's no decimal, if that makes sense. So the remainder is how many numbers away it was from dividing evenly. So in the case where it divides evenly, the remainder is going to be 0 because it's 0 away from dividing evenly. It already divides evenly. It doesn't need to subtract anything. Subtracting 0 does nothing. So instead of actually doing division here, I'm going to use the modulus command, which gives me the remainder. And in SQL Server, you do that with the % sign. So if I say, take the ID column, run the modulus of it using the number 2 as the value you're dividing with, then whatever that remainder is, check if it equals 0. Now, if I wanted to make this slightly more readable, I could put parentheses around this because that's kind of saying to group this whole thing so that the equal sign is comparing this entire group against the 0. The parentheses are not necessary because it already works. It already knows to group them. But if you didn't know the order of operations of how programming languages do comparisons, you might read it and think that it's checking if 2 equals 0, and that afterwards, whatever the answer was, it's doing the modulus between ID and that answer of 2 equals 0. So even if the parentheses are not required because you already know the default order of operations, so basically modulus has a higher precedence than equals, it can make it more readable if you add parentheses. So it's kind of a personal preference. It's up to you. And especially when you get into more complicated filters and you have multiple filters with and or with or, the parentheses help you to group individual criteria so that it's easier to read them. So let me run this code. It should fail because I have not yet done the duplicate check. However, I can at least see if the data is working correctly, or if my logic is working correctly. So even though it only wants me to return the city, I'm going to temporarily return the ID and rerun it so I can make sure that I only have even numbers. And it looks like I do. 794, 824, those all look even to me. And you can comment out individual lines of code with the double hyphen or double dash. And a comment means to ignore that line of code. So without deleting this code, I could run it without the where clause. So that way I could see if the odds appear by getting rid of that filter. And here I can see that I am getting odd numbers, 603, 619. And you'll also notice this scroll bar is really long. It's returning 400, 500 rows. If I wanted it to just be slightly faster, if I'm just doing a quick test, I can do something like top 1 or top 10 so that when I run it, my scroll bar doesn't return 500 results. So here you can say I only have 10. And that's important because in particular, when you're working at a real company and you're analyzing data, the tables may have millions or even billions of rows. And if you don't do a top 10 and you're just doing an example query to analyze some data, you might only actually need to visually look at the first few to analyze it logically. But if you're downloading a million records, that's going to use a lot of internet connection and it's going to use a lot of processing power on the database. And so you don't want to waste resources. So putting in that top and a number like 10 is valuable. Some people use a higher number like top 100, but honestly, I always use 10 because that's how much you can actually see on the screen at a time. You're probably not actually going to analyze that many rows most of the time. Okay, so I believe this logic is correct. The only thing I'm missing is this duplicate. And by doing it one piece at a time, it prevented me from getting overwhelmed trying to do too much at once. So now I'm just going to make them get rid of the duplicates. So the distinct that does a duplicate check. Now, I do need to remove this ID column for two reasons. One is the ID in most tables, we'll get into this a little bit later, but in most tables, the ID column is already going to be unique. So when I do distinct, it's actually checking all of the columns in one big comparison to see if they're unique. So even if the city was not unique, if the ID was unique, then because it's comparing them both simultaneously, it's going to say that the ID is unique. So this distinct is not going to filter anything out. But also I need to remove the ID because the answer said they only wanted me to return the city names. So as an example, if I had Las Vegas with the ID 1 and I had Las Vegas with the ID 2, if I run distinct on these two rows, they're already considered as a whole, the whole entire row is already considered unique. And so distinct would not get rid of any duplicates. But if I remove the ID, now these rows are identical. And so distinct would get rid of the one duplicate. So it would only have one value returned. So I think this should work now. Let's just see if I pass the test. Okay, it says I got it right. Okay, it says I got my first star. Maybe that means I'm at a good stopping point. Maybe I've done the basics of SQL. I'm not sure. So I think I'll stop right here. Feel free to keep going on your own if you'd like. I'll do another video in a few days going over the next set of queries. And my hope is if with this entire series, I'll do basic in one video, intermediate in another video, and just keep going. And once you've watched them all, you should be an expert and be able to get a job in SQL report writing if you wanted to. So thanks for watching. Give me a comment below if you have any questions or suggestions for the next video. Thanks.